When I began giving these talks, one of the first things that I suggested was that what we're learning in music theory is a kind of relearning or reshaping of our musical experience. That in a sense we already have music theory inside of us, and a course like this is designed to help us become more aware of the content of our musical experience and how we can shape that in the future. I drew the comparison with language, with the idea that we might have a native language, and yet often we find it very useful to go to school to study that language further. And one of the conventional things that we do when we take up a school learning of language is we learn to read and write. So not just to speak it, which we can be very good at without any school education whatsoever, but there's something that we can kind of add to our use of language when we learn how to read and write it. Now in music, reading and writing is concerned with something that we call notation. You can think of the idea of musical notes, which is one aspect of this that we're going to be interested in. Music notation is quite a broad concept, however, and one of the things that it is doing for us is making it possible to kind of take our musical experience, to set them outside of ourselves and contemplate them for ourselves, or to share those ideas and experiences with other people. In this sense, music notation is itself something that's deeply embedded in music theory in itself, because it is different from simply recording music. So for example, right now I could sit down at the piano, I could play something for you, and the sound on the iPhone that's recording this would take in all sorts of details that are particular to a performance that I would give that would not necessarily appear in music notation. Music notation is abstracting key components and not putting in absolutely all musical indications that are possible, right? So music notation in that sense has to have certain principles that it works from. Principles that will say, well, we want to capture this kind of feature, we want to capture that kind of feature. These are the crucial things that we want to use to create a foundation for reading and writing music, and that's distinct from simply recording it. Now, one point that I want to make is that even though being able to read and write music is a wonderful skill, this does not automatically make one an expert in music. For example, a composer that I used to study quite a lot, in fact that's who I wrote my doctoral thesis on, was a composer named Bela Bartok. And Bartok at one point in his career was asked, look, you're famous for working with folk musicians, and we were sort of wondering, when you're trying to notate that music for people who are not trained in that folk tradition, is there some way in which you need to jazz it up or make it more fancy so that it will be interesting to non-folk trained musicians? And Bartok said, oh, actually it's completely the opposite. There is so much going on in the performances of the music that I'm trying to capture in these forms of notation that I find myself feeling inadequate all the time. The music is just so complex. In a sense, Bartok was saying that he had to kind of dumb it down for people that were not trained in that tradition. And it was always something that he felt was a real constraint upon him. So I want us to keep that in mind, because no one was more attuned to the potential of music notation than a composer like Bela Bartok, but even he was extremely aware of the kind of limitations of what notation could or could not accomplish. So all of this is kind of a background to introducing what we're going to be talking about in this particular episode. We are interested in music notation in two fundamental dimensions. On the one hand, we're going to be taking up notions of duration and how do you capture, lengths of musical notes, that kind of thing. Also, what we're going to be interested in is this concept we were introduced to in the previous episode, the concept of pitch. So we're going to be dealing with essentially a kind of graphic form of notation that's based on pitch and time. So you could think of pitch as kind of the y-axis and time as the x-axis. And in this episode in particular, what we're going to be focusing on is that y-axis, pitch notation itself. Now, we also need to keep in mind the fact that the notation system that we are working with is graphic rather than tablature. In general, we can talk about two main types of music notation: tablature and graphic notation. Tablature means a form of notation that tells you how to produce pitches. Okay, so for example, nowadays a lot of guitar players and lute players use tablature to show them how to position their fingers on a fingerboard. Likewise, there are many beginning piano methods that use a form of tablature where you essentially have kind of a picture or drawing of a keyboard, and because a keyboard is a mixture of black and white keys, you can basically tell a piano player where to stick their fingers to produce the pitches that are desired. So that is what a tablature does. It tells you how to produce particular kinds of pitches. As opposed to that, we have something called the graphic system of notation, and that is something that also had a particular origin. In our case, that came from a system of notation that was developed for singers in the European Middle Ages, beginning in the early Middle Ages. And the reasons for that, I think, are obvious. If you are a singer, there's no simple way that you can write down and say, okay, to produce this particular pitch, tighten up your vocal cords this amount, force this much air through, and so on and so forth. There's no button that you can press on your throat to produce a particular pitch. So a graphic notation system is one that works with pitch relationships in themselves, okay? And this is something that was originally developed for a medieval repertoire of religious chants. However, the advantages of that quickly became apparent when other kinds of music were being written down, because there's a way in which a graphic system can be universal. It's something that singers can use, it's something that guitar players could use, or lutenists. It certainly is something that piano players can use. All sorts of instruments and voices can use the same notation system. So for that reason, that's going to be the lingua franca that we are working with in this course, and that's going to be our basic mode of operation throughout. However, one point I want to make clear is that the idea of a tablature is still an attractive one, because tablatures can be very effective in telling you how to produce pitches in very rapid fashion, and that can actually be extremely helpful for all kinds of instrumentalists. So later on in the course, we'll be talking about instruments that are called transposing instruments. There actually is a way in which we can use a graphic system of notation as a functional tablature at the same time. So right now, though I'm trying to draw a clear separation between tablature and graphic notation, ultimately we're going to discover how these things can be brought together. But the first thing that we need to do is familiarize ourselves with the graphic notation system. Now, historically, our system, as I mentioned before, comes from a time when the general idea was to try to preserve musical traditions across a wide range of religious institutions in a wide range of geographical areas. And of course, obviously this is long before the internet or the telephone or anything like that. In this sense, capturing music was crucial to trying to establish a more or less uniform religious practice. So at the same time that people wanted to be working, for example, from the exact same version of the Bible, in terms of their religious practices, in terms of their religious forms of celebration, they also were interested often in singing the same kinds of religious songs and that sort of thing. So there is a huge institutional movement put in place to try to say, okay, it might be difficult to have singers from Rome go up to London and sing all the repertoire that people would want to use for the same religious services. Isn't there some way that we could capture the way they sing things and just send that information on some manuscript to, London or Paris or any place that has a church, a cathedral, or a monastery, is there some way that we can capture this information effectively and clearly? Now, this system, surprisingly, is the one that is still in use today as the basis for our graphic notation system. It's kind of like a 1,000-year-old operating system. For that reason, it has a number of quirks. And the first one that I want to draw your attention to is this kind of dissonance, if you will, between what we learned about in the previous episode and the notation system that we're going to be learning today. So we talked about the idea of the pitch-class relationship, and I was already indicating that you could have the use of letters, like in an alphabet, to represent different pitch classes. So I said, for example, we could have a pitch class A, which would encompass a whole series of particular pitches of A. Or C. Now, if I were to go through those cycles on the standard piano, what I would find is that there are 12 pitch classes in total being used. Now, this is not a rule of any kind given by nature or anything like that. It is a cultural construct of long standing that we ended up with 12 pitch classes. Also, over time, the relationship to each other was modified. And what we are going to be assuming for the most part in this course is a division called equal temperament, okay? And we'll get into the details of that in episode 8. But here's the basic fact we want to work with: 12 pitch classes. Therefore, if you ever looked at a piano keyboard, you'll see a combination of white and black notes, and you'll see these clusters of 3 black keys and 2 black keys, 3 and 2, and these other white notes. If, for example, I were to play the first black key in the cluster of 3, I would hear this, and no matter where I played that first black key in that group of 3, I'd be hearing the same pitch class. Or I could play the white key that stands just below that. And so if I were to play through a sequence of these things on a piano, what I would hear is the 12 pitch classes that are in standard use. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then the pattern repeats. Okay, so 12 pitch classes seems to be the normal thing that we're working with. However, I also introduced this idea of not using numbers but letters to identify pitch classes. So rather than the pitch class 1, the pitch class 4, so what about the pitch class C or the pitch class G? So you might think, okay, rather than numbers, what we can do is just use letters to represent those numbers. So instead of pitch class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I could go letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, right? Now, here's the odd thing. We don't have a pitch class L. We don't have a pitch class K. We actually run out of pitch class identities at G. There are only 7-letter pitch class identities that we work with: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Why is that? This has everything to do with where our notation system comes from. When it was initially being developed, there was one particular strain of chant. It was Byzantine chant that was becoming very popular, and it worked with, conventionally, 7 pitch classes. Now, we don't know exactly why that particular set of pitch classes came to be the dominant one. Later on in this course, I will give us some possible reasons for that. I'll talk about that in episode 6. But the thing for us to keep in mind is that the notation system that was developed was one that was designed for just 7 pitch classes. And yet, nowadays, we're working all the time with 12 pitch classes. So how do we possibly fit these things together, 7 and 12? And likewise, why is it that we're still using a 7 pitch class system in terms of the representation of notes. There are all sorts of ways in which it might seem backward, and in fact it had seemed backward for many music theorists and composers even centuries ago. All sorts of new ideas for notation systems were put forward. However, there is something interesting about this particular 7-based system that hung on and continued to prove its usefulness. So for that reason, as music has developed over time, in a sense, it's like we've always been searching for sort of backwards compatibility with the 7-pitch class system. So just to give you a picture of it, remember I've told you that the basic pitch class identities that we work with, not exclusively, but the basic ones, the points of reference are letters A through G. We have behind me right here a stylized clock face that I've written out. Letters are not placed there yet. We have just these numbers, 1 through 12. And when I look at these things, all right, I'm hoping that it will seem a little bit familiar to us, the idea of a clock, but also not just a 12-hour clock, but for example, a 24-hour clock. So you could imagine 1 p.m., go up 12 hours and come to 1 a.m., and then another 12, you're back to p.m., a.m., and back and forth it goes. So these things aren't stuck just representing one thing, right? There's a way in which we can go up 12 steps, if you will, and come back to where we started out. So you might start to get some idea of why I have this here, because, for example, let's say I wanted to associate the letter A with 1 o'clock, right? So I could start at 1 o'clock here and go through the hours, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then come back to 1 again. And for me, 1 o'clock, which could be 1 a.m., 1 p.m., might correspond to the idea of A o'clock, or the pitch class A. Now, unlike AM and PM, my musical clock can go up multiple times. So it's kind of like what I'm looking at is a spiral staircase, right? So if I were looking at it overhead and someone were playing these notes on a piano, and I could see each of these things being lit up, right, as someone stepped along them, viewed from above, I'm just seeing things going in a circle, constantly returning to itself. I could go to another o'clock, 3 o'clock. I'm going to call that B. That would be there. So that's 2 o'clock. And again, I could go 2 o'clock, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. 12 hours later, I come back to the same B o'clock, 3 o'clock, the pitch class B. So viewed from above, I seem to just be going in circles, but if I viewed it from the side as a spiral staircase, I could see my musical fingers going up or down that spiral staircase. So now what I want to do is show us how the letters fit with this 12-hour system. And the first thing that I need to do is place my A here. Actually, that's not terribly right. Let's see if I can put it in red. There, I think it'll be a bit more clear. Okay, so that's A o'clock. If I put in my B, that's where it happens to be. So if I were playing these things on a piano, what you would hear is that I play a note in between these two. So if I start at A, I'll put it in a middle register. So that's A, that's something, and that's B o'clock, okay? C is actually right here. D o'clock is there. E o'clock is here. F o'clock is there. And then G o'clock is there. So now we start to notice something quite striking. There are gaps in the system. And in fact, the only time we move from 1 hour directly to the next is between B and C and E and F. Now, there's a way in which we can name these gaps, and it's going to be the first kind of naming system for intervals that we'll be using on a regular basis. Rather than the ratios we learned about in the previous episode, we're going to slowly develop new ways of identifying intervals. So if I happen to take a step from B to C, or from E to F, so you can hear B to C and E to F, there's no hour in between. I can say I'm taking a half step, and the half step produces what we call a semitone. Half step, semitone, that sounds partial, that sounds weird to me because these are hours, are they not? They are whole hours. Why is it that when these things take place, if I move from B to C or E to F, that's moving a full hour? Why am I describing it as a half or semi-something? Well, it has to do with what the ordinary size of step is. If I look at these other ones, A to B, or C to D, or D to E, or F to G, or G to A, there are 5 of those things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of those kind of leaping steps, if you will. Only 2 of these. What that means is that in this system, the normal thing to be doing is to be skipping over an hour. That's the normal thing. This is the exception, and it's going to be a very important exception, as we'll come to appreciate throughout this series. So if this is the normal thing, why don't we call it the regular thing, the whole thing? So going from there to there, rather than taking a half step, in this context, I'm going to call it taking a whole step. That's the normal kind of step to be taking. And when I do that, the interval that's produced is something that we call a whole tone. Okay? So taking a whole step produces a whole tone between A and B, C and D, D and E, F and G, G and A. Taking a half step produces a semitone, and that's what we get between B and C and E and F. So now we have a picture of how at least this really odd lettering system, only using the letters A through G, because that's all that was necessary at the time that this system was being developed. Now we can see how that maps onto the 12-pitch class universe that we want to be operating in. Now, I did mention before that this could be conceived of as a clock face, or maybe to extend upon that idea, the notion of a spiral staircase of some time, where you can go up or down multiple times, right? There are multiple AO clocks, multiple BO clocks, multiple CO clocks, right? If that's the case, then there must be some way that I can be more specific, because after all, if I'm going to be writing music down, and I want to do that to be able to communicate my ideas to some other musicians, I'm going to want to be sensitive to what those musicians are capable of. For example, if I'm writing a piece of music for a piano actually has a huge range of O-clocks to work from, all right? I can start at 8 o'clock down here. That's my first AO clock, second, third, fourth, fifth, 6th, 7th, 8th. That's a huge number. I might not feel particularly limited in the number of pitches that I can notate for a pianist. I mean, I have to keep in mind, of course, what they're capable of playing, but the instrument itself can encompass a huge range of available pitches. But if I'm writing for voices, if I'm writing for wind instruments, if I'm writing for stringed instruments, I'm going to have to be more attentive to the particular limitations or range within which they can effectively operate. So I'm going to need to be able to distinguish between a high AO clock and a low AO clock. So what I need to do is go from pitch class back to pitch and see how I can bring these things together. So the next thing that I'm going to show you is how I can take this spiral staircase idea and I'm going to unspool it across the board, and we'll see how we can start to identify particular versions of each of these pitch classes. You know, A3 or C4, things like that. That's going to be very important. So that's going to be the next step. After that, then, what I'll be interested in is trying to fill in these gaps. What are we going to do about them? Because we have many gaps that need to be filled. Okay, we're back, and you'll see that what I've done is written my little musical alphabet of 7 pitch class letters over and over and over again, starting low down and going high up. And what I'm trying to represent is what these things would sound like if I were to play them going along a standard keyboard. I do have a whole series of videos connected with this channel. It's called Keyboard-Based Music Theory, where I talk about how to use a piano keyboard, how to work with it. It will be particularly useful to us later on in this class, in particular when we get to episode 8. But if you ever want to quickly get to know a keyboard, you can take a peek at those videos right now. But one thing I can tell you is that when you look at a piano keyboard, the white keys correspond to this A, B, C, D, E, F, G thing. And already you can probably tell that this is something that suggests a kind of tablature is in place. Because if a piano player sees an A or an F or a G or something like that, they already in a certain sense physically know where to put their hands, okay? And we're going to develop that idea later on. It's going to be tremendously useful to us. Anyhow, just to give you some idea of what I've done, I'll play from there up to where I've ended up over there. So I've got my first A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then I'm back to A o'clock, but now PM version A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Next set A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, etc., because I could keep going. So I have a sense of these units that are repeating or recurring. So I can kind of show that to myself by putting in these brackets so I can quickly see and perceive where the units of repetition are. There's something else that I can do, and I could say, for example, I'm going to call this group Group 1, this Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, Group 5. Now, in music theory, the term that we use for these groupings when we're talking about associations by frequency range, we use the term register, okay? So I could call this Register 1, Register 2, Register 3, Register 4, Register 5. Now, quick note, there are many different systems that are used to indicate register, and I'm going to be teaching you a very particular one that happens to be the kind of North American standard. It's not something that's used in all English-speaking music theory systems, but it's one that's favored by the International Acoustic Society. So this is something that is not just a musical but also a scientific standard. So that's why we're going to be working with it. So I'm going to make some modifications along the way so that we tie into that system. But the first thing I want to get across is how we can use the musical alphabet and its repetition through these pitch class echoes to set up a basic system of registers. So then if I have this in place, what I could do is say, all right, if I want to identify a particular A in one of these registers, well, I could call this in register 1 A1, this A in register 2 A2, this A in register 3 A3, this A in register 4 A4, register 5 A5, A6, etc. And then that would be true for any of these pitches, right? So this would be B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, B6, etc. C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, etc. Now, that is a logical system. I like to call that the basic system. One of the attractions of it is the fact that it actually does correspond with a standard piano keyboard. So there are many different makes and models of piano. Electronic keyboards, some of them have the full range of 88 keys. Many have sort of a shorter range. What I'm playing on right here is a small grand piano. Typically, most grand pianos have an 88 key range. There are some pianos like made by the company Busendorfer, for example, that extend the range quite a bit, but the standard actually is to start with A. So in a system like this, it maps very neatly onto a standard piece of music technology. However, the register idea, starting with a particular pitch class that happens to be the beginning of the musical alphabet, that's nice and logical, but it's not going to be the system that we end up using because, for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later in this episode, we're going to discover that actually we skip out the first A and B and we start everything with C. Okay? So the system that we are going to be using actually operates like this. Okay? So, in that case, yes, this is C1, yes, that's C2, yes, that's C3, because this is register 1, this is register 2, this is register 3, this is register 4, this is register 5. All of this is true, but what has to change are the designations for A and B. So this is the pitch class A, but it's not the pitch A1. In fact, in this system, it doesn't exist. Here, however, what had been the start of a new register will now be the tail end of the first register, and I'll make those adjustments all through here. And so on. Oh, and this is important. That's going to be B5 now. So the A's and the B's are fitting into the tail end of each register now, okay? The registers will be defined by C. And in fact, what we'll discover in a little while is that this system, although it seems to go from left to right like the more basic system, nonetheless is actually based on a kind of symmetry around, in particular, this particular pitch C4, which is known as middle C. Now, I've been comparing this sort of stuff to standard keyboards. Often people say, oh, middle C is because it's the approximate middle of the keyboard. That might be the case, but that's not why it's called middle C. There's another reason for it, which is not approximately anything. It's precisely in the middle of something. And that's going to be the system of clefs, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But what we have now is our register system in place, meaning that we can have the advantages of the pitch-class relationship, which provides a really powerful form of coherence for the system that we're working within. At the same time, we're in a position to be very precise about the particular register, the particular pitch that's being intended when we notate music. So for that reason, now I will be able to distinguish between notating happy birthday for a bass or baritone voice like my own, way down here, or one that might be sung by a soprano. So that case, I was starting down at C2, and the other one was starting at C5. So I'd be able to be very specific about that. The sequence of pitch classes C, D, C, F, E is the same sequence of pitch classes, so that's why it sounds like the same melody, but I'm able to distinguish between a low register and a high register, and I can correspondingly notate very precisely for voices or instruments that can sing in those ranges. But of course, what this is leaving out still are all the gaps, right? If we go back to the idea of the clock face, we have those whole tones. They seem to be skipping over important pitches that we want to be able to use embedded within the system. So what I'm going to do now is step back from this bigger picture and just focus on one register, and I'll allow it to represent all of them. In this case, what I'm going to do is start with the alphabet system again, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and we're going to begin to figure out how we can fill in those gaps and talk a little bit more about why those gaps are there, why they are still being used in modern notation. Okay, so what I've done is selected one alphabetic range, A through G. It's kind of like taking that spiral clock from 1 o'clock up to 1 a.m. back to 1 p.m. or 1 p.m. back to 1 a.m. and put it in a linear form. So A o'clock, B o'clock, C o'clock, D o'clock, E o'clock, F o'clock, G o'clock, A o'clock. And we see the same gaps that are there. So we know that these represent pitch classes. However, we could assign a particular register to them. So what we're going to do is just generalize something about these gaps, and then we would also be able to apply that register system to them. So what I notice is that there are pitches and pitch classes that I'm going to want to be able to use in these particular areas, and they have no particular letter name. Now, what we do in standard notation system is to represent them in terms of one of the A through G pitch class identities. So for example, this 5 o'clock, all right, that is something that I could hear either in terms of C or D. I can hear that as higher than C, or I can hear it as lower than D. So I can hear it in relation to one of these other identities. I'll give you an example. I'll play a little melody that for the most part is going to be following these stations of the clock, and at some point I'm going to make an error or something like that by stumbling into one of these missing areas. So I'm going to start with C, and I'll play the tune like this. What I did is I went C, D, E, F, G, G, F, E, D, C, and I will sing as little as possible while I do these talks for obvious reasons. Now what I'm going to do is start that melody out again and make an error. So I went C, D, E, F, G, G, F, E, D, oops. Now the oops that I heard should have been this, should have been C. So when I make that mistake, if you will, that is something that in a sense I don't register just by itself, but as a replacement for something else, that this is taking the place of that. I hear this in terms of that. So this sounds a little bit higher than what it should have been. Now you might remember the vocabulary we started to learn, where we said, all right, these standard steps, if you will, call them whole steps, or take a whole step, you produce a whole tone, right? If I went directly from 1 hour position to the next, that would be taking a half step produces a semitone. So the semitone relationship is an interesting one. That's going to be the one that we use to describe these other relative positions. So when I was playing that tune, C, D, E, F, G, G, F, E, D, something like C, but a semitone higher than C, Semitone higher than, we use the term sharp. And we represent that by using something that looks a little bit like a number sign at an angle. So I could say that when I was playing this melody, I played C, D, E, F, G, G, F, E, D, C sharp. And in fact, that's what I heard it as, is a semitone higher than it ought to have been. It should have been a C. Instead, I get something that's sharp for C, that's a semitone higher than that. So that's one possibility. And of course, I don't have to leave it as a mistake. I can incorporate it into my little piece. And so what I've done is continue playing the melody until I got back to not C sharp, but my original C. And then the melody sounded like it could come to a close. So this, in that particular context, sounded like something that was not the norm, something that was not natural. It sounded like some kind of change had been made to something that ought to have been, something that ought to be natural. Now, there's a term that we can use to describe these particular pitch classes if they are left unaltered, all right? So I can say that C. If I want to, I could also say, just to be clear, that's C natural. That's C that's not being affected by anything else, right? And I actually do have a little symbol that I can apply to that if I wanted to. I don't need to in this context, but I could indicate that accidental in that one. Call that C natural, all right? B natural, A natural, D natural. This is the sort of thing that I would use if that had been used, to say, you know what, actually I might have used that for a moment, but this is what I really want. I kind of want to turn that indication off, all right? So natural will be used in that context. But if it's the case that I have the possibility to hear this pitch class 5 o'clock in terms of that, I should also be able to hear it in terms of this as a semitone lower than something else, a semitone lower in this case than D. Now, in the context of the melody that I just played for you, I wouldn't actually hear that as a semitone lower than D. I hear it as a replacement, as a semitone lower than D. I hear it as a replacement for C, but logically I could also describe it as semitone lower than D. When I do that, I apply something that's called a flat, and it looks like kind of a B that's a little bit squished at the bottom, like it's got a belt on it, it's a bit too tight, and that means a semitone lower than the thing in terms of which it's named. In this case, a semitone lower than the pitch or pitch class D. So what we start to notice is that for these seeming gaps, I have no problems coming up with identities for them. This could be either A sharp or B flat. This could be either D sharp or D flat. This could be either F sharp or G flat. And this could be either G sharp or A flat. So I have choices to make. Those choices will depend on musical context, just like the example that I gave here, where I could have chosen one or the other. The one that made the most logical sense, certainly in terms of what my ear was hearing, was to identify it as C sharp. And by the way, this is how the system began to grow. So I was talking about that Byzantine chant that was starting out using just these 7 basic pitch class identities. Well, every once in a while, a singer could bring in a slight change like this. They called it musica ficta, where you actually, in a sense, create a fictitious note, not the real thing, not the proper thing, not the natural thing. And so this kind of notation system came into play because there was room for it. It was heard in the context of 7 regular or natural pitches. So these kinds of changes were introduced as not the norm, as somehow accidental rather than natural. It's an Aristotelian category distinction the accidental being something that is not the norm, that is not natural, that's in some sense perceived as a departure from the natural, the way things ought to be. So that's how it begins. We still retain the term accidental to describe these kinds of notation devices, the sharp, the flat, the natural sign. We call them accidentals, even though nowadays they are frequently used as though they are the norm. So it's a little bit of a funny use of terminology. Don't worry about it right now, because we're going to talk about these ideas much more later on in the series when we talk about things that are called diatonic collections, notions of key and mode and key signature. Everything will become clear then. Just note that the idea of the accidental comes from the 7-pitch class system, where every once in a while something would seem to go wrong, something would seem to not be right, and that ultimately the thing that was natural would be restored. So it was heard as a departure from the norm, the normal collection. All right, so we have these 3 accidental signs that can be used. One thing that I want to point out now is that, yes, I can make a choice whether to use a sharp or a flat depending on context, but what I can't help but notice is that evidently these seem to indicate the same thing. Now, I mentioned before that we are dealing with a 12-pitch class universe, more precisely one that is in what we call equal temperament. Now, I'll be very precise about what I mean about that in episode 8. All I want you to recognize right now is that on a standard piano, for example, or instruments tuned to the piano, these really are the same thing. I mean, if I play this by itself, you can't tell whether I played the D flat first or the C sharp first. In fact, you can't tell whether I played the C sharp twice or the D flat twice. There is no difference between them in an equal tempered setting, okay? So they are precisely the same pitch or pitch class. Right? Which of those were C sharps, which were D flats? Even I don't know. I just played what would be used to play them on a keyboard, but I don't actually know outside of any given context which they will happen to be. Now, what that means is that when we come to places like these, we have an equivalence in our notation system, and we have a special name for it. We call it enharmonic equivalence. And what that means is that it's possible for us to make these kinds of notation choices. And in fact, in some ways, if we hear the musical context and we know enough about how music behaves, we'll have a sense of which of those enharmonic equivalents it might be. So for example, I could play something like this, and I want to focus on this particular pitch. Now, what I'm playing is 10 o'clock, F sharp or G flat. Which is it? By itself, I don't know. But if I hear something coming from it, there's been a particular musical sequence that we call a chord progression. We'll talk about those in episode 12. And based on how the chord progression has worked, as a trained musician, I know that this was G flat. However, I could start out with this same sonority again. And in that case, even though I started in exactly the same place with exactly the same collection of pitches, in that case, I know, again, as a trained musician, that it wasn't a G flat, it was an F sharp because of the way it resolved. So there is a way in which harmonic practice can help us to distinguish between these things, but just as a basic acoustic fact, by itself, if I just listen to that pitch, right now, I actually don't know whether it's an F sharp or a G flat. It's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. Until something happens, I don't know what that thing is. I don't know what's inside the box. Is it a F sharp? Is it a G flat? I have to wait for another event to determine what it happens to be. And that's because of equal temperament and enharmonic equivalence. So I could say, for example, that C sharp and D flat in general are, in an equal tempered system, enharmonically equivalent pitch classes. I could also say, so that's going to be true for all of these, right? Enharmonically equivalent pitch classes, C sharp and D flat. Or I could say there's a particular pitch which is enharmonically equivalent. That's C sharp, D flat. I don't know which until I'm given some context, until it behaves in a certain way. So I can use the term enharmonic equivalence with respect to both pitch class, globally speaking, and pitch in a more narrow sense. So now we have the possibility for identifying 12 pitch classes using an alphabetic system that will have some variations made possible through the use of accidentals, principally the sharp and the flat right now. Later on in this course, we'll discover that we can double up on these things, double sharp, double flat, but we're not going to trouble ourselves with that just yet. And there's one further thing to note, and that is, look, it is possible for me to fill in the gaps in that fashion, but it's also possible, and this will seem crazy at first, for me to do that kind of thing in these B, C, and E, F semitone relationships that are there in the alphabetic system itself. So for example, is that an E? Sure, but I could also identify that in terms of F. I could call that an F flat if I wanted to, in which case I can note that E and F flat are enharmonically equivalent, either enharmonically equivalent pitches, if it's a particular one, or enharmonically equivalent pitch classes. Likewise, I could call that F, but I could also identify it in terms of E as E sharp. So F and E sharp are enharmonically equivalent. Likewise, over here, B could be understood as C flat, and C could be understood or heard as B sharp. And at this point, you might think, well, that's kind of just a logical extension. We have no need for that because what could be simpler than just using B or just using C? Later on, when we talk about these things called diatonic collections, we will discover that actually, in many cases, these altered versions, these enharmonic equivalents, will be easier to understand, will be easier to perceive than a plain old vanilla B, C, E, or F. So right now it might just seem like a logical extension, completely unnecessary. Actually, later on this is going to turn out to be tremendously useful, tremendously simplifying, in fact. And it's one of the reasons why this 1,000-year-old operating system, just 7 basic pitch class identities, still persists to this day. The need to kind of adapt for occasional changes gradually became an asset, okay? And it's something that turns this form of notation into a kind of filter of essential and less essential information. There's a way in which music notation, of course, can just be read as, you know, information on one plane, but we're going to discover that music notation actually kind of has a staging effect, that there are crucial parts to the music notation that we kind of want at the forefront, and then other components that we don't want to have in the foreground. They are either temporary or background features. We don't want all information crowding in on us all at once. It turns out that this basic 7 pitch class system is going to be really good at filtering information for us in a way that's just fantastically effective. So it's a great piece of graphic technology. All right, so speaking of graphic, what we need to do is show how we can take this information and actually portray it in graphic terms. So that's going to be the next thing that we take a look at. So you'll see that I've cleared the board, and one of the reasons why I've done that is because, of course, I want to put more information on, but I want us to observe the fact that there's information here already. If you go into any standard music classroom at a university, you will see boards, whiteboards, chalkboards that have these kinds of symbols all over them. And what they are is the basic for our graphic system. These are called musical staves or a musical staff. And a staff is something that's composed of lines and spaces. Now, over time, these staves have changed in their dimensions. If you look into the course notes for Music 103, you'll see that I have some representations of forms of notation from the early and later Middle Ages, and you can literally see a growth of staff lines, where we start out with just a single line and odd forms of music notation that we call neumes, N-E-U-M-E-S, where they're seemingly written a bit above or a bit below or on the line or far away from it. And it's kind of like there was a visual horizon line that would correspond with the structure of a melody, a piece of chant. And if you think back to the example that I played for you when I wanted to introduce the idea of the accidental and being able to step outside the 7-pitch class framework, what I did to kind of restore order to that melody was to come back to where I started. So I'd begun with C. That was this C sharp that seemed to intrude on the natural order of things. And at that point, I came back to my original C. So I had a sense not just of a random sequence of notes forming a melody, but a melody that undertook a journey of some kind. It started in one place and ended up back in the same place. So that particular pitch C, it happened to be C4, or middle C, as we'll soon come to understand why. That is something that isn't just a kind of visual fact, it's something that my ear uses to navigate the melody itself. I can tell when I've gone away from that opening pitch, when I should have come back to it and I didn't, and that disturbed me, and then my ear is kind of left waiting for that mystery to be resolved. So that particular pitch C provided a point of reference throughout the melody. It's not just a series of pitches, but pitches that I hear in relation to a starting and ending point. So in a sense, what you can do with this kind of basic notation is establish a line in your notation and say, all right, that is going to be the point of reference for a particular melody. Maybe it begins and ends on C, and then I can indicate these other notes above or below it, and I'll know that the piece is over when I come back to this particular pitch that's provided a framework or an oral horizon line for the melody as a whole. But of course, you look at something like that and you go, well, that's nice, but how far away are these other pitches? How do I judge them? So this is why you see in this sort of growth of music notation, graphic notation in the Middle Ages, a corresponding growth of the use of staff lines. But it's not just the lines that indicate where pitches can be, it's also the spaces in between. So some of the examples, the later examples that you'll see in the course notes use 4 lines, and the spaces in between are also used to indicate pitch or pitch class locations. Now, if that's the case, then what you need to do is provide some form of orientation for the system, because what the unaltered lines and spaces are going to correspond with are the unaltered pitch classes A through G, right? If that's the case, then how do I know which line or which space is A or B or C or what have you? So what you need is a kind of key, and our term for key is a clef. It's something that says, hey, this particular line corresponds to this particular pitch class, I'll say for now, and you can use that to judge what these other lines and spaces mean. Now, in the standard set of clefs that we work with, we have clefs for C, F, and G. All All right. So if, for example, I happen to want to indicate a particular C, this is one way of drawing that clef by hand. What I'm showing you is that this is supposed to be kind of like biting or chewing on this particular line, telling me that this is C, okay? Now, rather than writing those squarish neumes, I'll write circular note heads. And I'll be talking more about what these mean in the next episode. Anyhow, so I call that C, and what that means then is that I've established a point of orientation for the entire staff. So if that's C, going from bottom to top is going up alphabetically. So this would be D, that would be E, that would be F, that would be G, and then that would be A. And I seem to run out for the time being. I haven't actually run out. I'll show you how I can extend the system in a moment. But I just want us to get the basic idea in place. If that's the case, C, D, E, F, G, A, and then the alphabet starts again, then that meant that the alphabet could also have gone back this a ways, right? So if I move my clef back over here, if that's C, then the position just below it is B, the position just below that is A, position just below that is G, position just below that is F, position just below that is E, and so on, okay? So this might tell me where C is, but it doesn't just tell me that. It's establishing C as a point of reference for all these other pitch classes, right? I can move this around. If that's representing a fancy C, and that's the idea, right? That these clefs, as we have them now, I mean, this is typical for a hand-drawn version of a C clef. There are much nicer ones in print, as you can see from the course notes or in standard music publications. But this is generally how we write things so that we can recognize the C clef. I can move that around. So for example, I could put it in this position. And in that case, I've got these things, call them dealy bobbers, whatever you want, kind of biting on this line, telling me that that now is C, all right? So that would mean if that's C, then this would be E, right? This would be A, this would be B, right? And so on. So the clef doesn't have to stay in just one position. All of these clefs in principle are movable ones. In modern practice, it tends to be the C clefs that we use in that way. C clefs are a kind of flexibility that's built into the system. The F and the G clefs tend to be fixed, although that isn't always the case. And so one of the things that I'll be doing for you in assignments for this course is sometimes I'll be moving around the other clefs as well, just to make sure you understand what they represent. So C clefs can move around to different positions. In this case now that's C, D, E, etc., or B, etc., right? But note that when I move them around, I'm not just moving them to any old place. Specifically, what a clef is indicating is a particular staff line rather than a staff space. And the reason for that is simple and obvious. It makes it very clear by having a line indicated by the clef that this is what our point of reference will be. It's hard to come up with a graphic design that will make spaces very clear. You won't see C clefs doing something like that at any point, identifying a space. Clefs always identify staff lines for the sake of clarity. So yes, they can move around, but only from line to line to line. So that's an example of C clef. An F clef follows the same principles. So for example, the letter F by itself is quite nice because it kind of comes with its own dealy bobbers. I don't have to do anything with it in terms of calligraphy to draw out some feature that will highlight something. In a sense, I really didn't have to with a C clef either. I mean, I could write a C so it does something like that. Ultimately, the idea was to kind of dress it up a bit and make it fancy. So whatever version of a C clef you end up seeing, ultimately it's derived from a letter C that's chomping away like Pac-Man on some particular line. Well, the F clefs are a little bit more obvious. In terms of the calligraphy of them, over time, people got a little bit more fancy, so rather than just having a boring straight back to the F, they might put a nice curl on it. And over time, rather than drawing out those dealy bobbers, they just put a couple dots there. That is a stylized letter F. And what it's telling me is that chomp, 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 whatever is on this line is F. That's why it is an F clef. Therefore, this is a G. This is an A. This is a B. Below this is an E. This is a D. That would be true whether the F clef was in that position or if it was somewhere else, like there. Then this would be F, this would be G, this would be A, this would be B, and so on. This would be E, etc. So again, F clefs can and do move around, but they never do that as much as C clefs. If they do, however, once again, they are going to be focusing on a particular staff line to provide orientation. Now, the G clef is a bit of an oddity because it's not a stylized letter G. You might have heard The Sound of Music at some point in your life, and there's a song in that movie, that musical, that's the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do song. Do, a deer, female deer, re, a drop of golden sun, etc. That's the solfege system. I won't explain the details of that, but in that system, G is represented as sol, S-O-L. So it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay? So S for sol, S for G. So if you write a fancy S, you can do that. You can do that kind of thing. So stylized S, and what is being created here is kind of like a, I don't know, a target site or something like that, right? It's focusing on this particular line, saying this is G, right? And in that case, that would be A, B, C, etc., right? F, E, and so on, right? So we have C clef, F clef, and a G clef, and we need to figure out what we can do to get beyond just what's available on the conventional staff, because we seem to run out of space, right? So for example, if I were working with my G clef, and for some reason I decided, oh, I want to go quite high up, well, that's G again, F and E. Well, what if I wanted to go to A, or B above that, or C above that? How am I going to indicate that? Because it starts to look like those floating neumes that we saw in the earliest forms of medieval notation. How can I secure these things? Well, there's an idea of staff lines that invisibly extend on either side of the staff. So literally all I'm seeing are these 5 lines in the enclosed 4 spaces, but in behind them, available for use, are hidden staff lines. And when I need them, segments of the staff lines become visible to me. So if I wanted to have an A, well, there is a hidden staff line for A, and a segment of it can pop up when I need it to give me a position for A. Likewise, if I needed a C, a couple more segments can materialize to make that available. Or if I wanted something in between a B, I don't want to have more of these segments than are necessary. I just want the minimum amount necessary, so I could have a B indicated that way. So what I'm trying to show you is how there are these hidden staff lines just waiting to be used, and when they appear, you're just seeing a segment of them. We call those segments ledger lines, all right? Ledger lines because it's a way of making it possible to create particular locations for pitches, pitch classes outside the normal frame of reference that's provided by the staff. I can have ledger lines above, or I can have ledger lines below. So there's G, F, E, D. I can have C. I can have B below that. I can have A below that. All right? So ledger lines give us some kind of flexibility without giving us too much available information all at once, right? So rather than having, 8 staff lines, which could be hard to read, most of the time we're hoping we'll see this music notated within the context of the 5 lines and spaces, and then whenever we need to pop outside of that, the hidden staff lines are available as ledger lines at any point in time. But you do need to use both of them. I mean, here for example, I wouldn't be able to read that as A if I only saw, that one segment of a hidden staff line. It'd be like, is that like a C that's somehow fallen down a bit and isn't being held in place properly? No, if I need to know that's an A, I need to have both of those ledger lines employed, okay? Now, when I'm working with these things, remember we introduced the use of accidentals, and when I was writing those out, I'd say things like A sharp, D flat, that sort of thing, and I would write it in hand notation in this way, okay? However, when I'm using accidentals on a musical staff, I notate it as though I was saying sharp A or flat D. Flip it around. The reason for that is, if I'm reading this musical pitch time graph from left to right, I want to have the information that I need to correctly read the staff in front of me as soon as possible. I don't want to go C sharp, whoops. I was supposed to play, I thought C, and then, oh, mistake, it was supposed to be a sharp, or, D flat, whoops, I made a mistake. I want to have the alteration prepared for me, okay? So even though I say C sharp or D flat, the notation always puts the accidental in front of the particular pitch location. Likewise, I need to be very clear about this. If I write something like sharp this, that's just floating off in space. And I sometimes see this in students' hand notation where they think it's going to be clear if they take the accidentals and they remove them from the center of the action. So you can go, oh, right, there should be a sharp thing after that. However, this is confusing to a musician because that seems to be in a position for something like a G or an A sharp, something up here. The accidental must be precisely over the line or space that it is modifying, okay? So that is what I should see. This is what I should see. That is C sharp, that is D flat. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I'm seeing a D, and I'm guessing that at some point there might be an E flat afterwards. So for example, if I were writing a pair of notes that I want to hear at the same time, like this, if I want to hear them at the same time, the note heads must be touching each other. So for clarity's sake, the accidental will go in front of the pair, and I'll know to play that as D, E flat, and not D flat, E. Just because there's no space to put the accidental in between, it has to go in front of the pair. So that's where I'll look at something like that and go, well, of course, that's not a D flat. That flat sign is clearly over the space for E. And so this is why that will sound completely different from something like this. So this is and D flat and E, and this is D, E flat. Sounds like a completely different interval. It's a semitone. All right? Now, these clefs, they are derived from letter representations to indicate a particular pitch class. However, they also have other names. So for example, you might have heard of things like a bass clef or an alto clef or a treble clef. Where do those terms come from? So I've been saving this piece of information for the end of this discussion because the first thing that we need to know is what the clefs actually mean. That's crucial because there's a way in which if you sing in a particular range or play an instrument of some kind that uses certain kinds of clefs all the time, you tend to lose sight of what the clefs themselves mean. And what that means is that you lose your understanding of how clefs work, and then if you have to read some other clef, like say you're playing in a group of instruments and you're used to always reading, I don't know, bass clef and this thing called a treble clef, whatever they happen to be, and suddenly there's this alto clef and you don't use it to play your own instrument, you might go, well, I don't have a clue how to read this thing. I don't know what it means. I don't know what to do with it. If you know that an alto clef happens to be a C clef, whether you use it frequently or not, you'll be able to figure it out. Okay? So this is why the first thing that we need to know about clefs is what letters they designate, what pitch classes they designate. And yet, one of the things I was emphasizing just before this segment was the fact that we have not just a notion of pitch class, but also of register. So register homes for those pitch classes so that I can distinguish between them. And this is why we have a further association of the clefs, the F clef, the C clef, and the G clef, with these names like bass, treble, alto, tenor. Those represent, roughly speaking, ranges of notes that kind of extend beyond simple registers, but they are something that can very clearly map onto register. Now, if I go back to that register system that I was showing you before, so for example, about C3, D3, E3, F3, G3, A3, B3, C4, so I'm starting the next register, D4, E4, F4, G4. If I were to play that on a piano, right? Could keep going. A4, B4, right? And then starting the next C5. Here's an interesting fact. This C4 is 5 positions from this F and that G. Okay? See that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Soon enough, we'll discover that we can call that range by a particular interval name called a fifth. Even though it sounds like a fraction, it's not supposed to mean a fraction. It means 5 basic positions. Okay? Now, this C4 is what all the C clefs indicate. They don't just indicate the pitch class C. Specifically, what they show when they bite on a particular line is the pitch C4, which, as I mentioned before, is also known as middle C. Why? Because it's precisely in the middle of what the F clef and the G clef show. The G clef doesn't just indicate any old pitch class G. Specifically, it indicates the pitch G4 that is 5 positions above middle C. The F clef specifically indicates the pitch F3 5 positions below middle C. So in that sense, this indicates a kind of middle range, if you will, and it can be positioned in different places on the staff, of course, but these are more at the extremes, a higher extreme and a lower extreme. And in fact, where the G clef is positioned, you might recall, is relatively low in the staff, meaning that it's optimized for pitches higher up. The F clef, you might recall, is positioned relatively high in the staff, meaning it's optimized to show pitches below that. So if we go to a kind of conventional terminology for describing ranges, if I were to sing in a choir, I would be amongst the basses, okay? Because my voice generally sings in a lower range. Above me in the standard male vocal range would be the tenors. And then if we go into women's voices, the lower female range is the alto, the higher range generally soprano, SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Another term to indicate a higher register or a higher range isn't just soprano but treble. And so we discover that the F clef also has come to be known as the bass clef. C clefs, there are a variety of them. The two standard ones are alto and tenor. They're not restricted to that. Those are the standard ones. And then G clef is known as a treble clef. So these terms indicate approximately the ranges for which those clefs are optimized. So all of these are centered around middle C. So that's why it's called middle C. It has nothing to do with the keyboard. It has to do with this symmetry of the 3 standard clef types that we work with. And on that basis, the International Society for Acousticians said, all right, we're going to base our register system on C. Now, can we visualize that? Very easily by showing ourselves how this fits together. In ascending sequence. So, for example, if I have a G or treble clef up here, a C or alto clef there, a C or tenor position clef there, and an F or bass clef there, what I'm going to do is show you where middle C is, C4, the pitch C4, in each of these clef systems. So, sorry they're drawn a little bit sloppily, but it's really easy to read an alto clef because the middle line of the 5 lines, beautifully symmetrical, is C4, okay? For the tenor clef, it's shifted slightly up visually, but what that means is that the optimization for the staff is now shifted down. It's taking something that's in middle position for the altos, and now it's lifting it up. So pitches that are below middle C are going to be more accessible. So that's also C4. And correspondingly for the F clef, this is indicating F3, but where is C4? Actually, it's right there. Need a ledger line above. For, I'll keep track of these names. Tenor position for the C clef is the bass position for the F clef, and treble position, right, for the G clef. Here is C4, again, ledger line below. So now you have a very immediate sense of the optimization of each of these clefs. Okay? So if this is middle C, this particular clef is optimized for pitches that will be higher in range than middle C. In this case, you can clearly see how this clef, F clef, is optimized for positions well below that, right? So the extremes in range, treble and bass, can clearly be seen by locating where middle C is. The altos and the tenors, you can see where the names come from because alto is optimized for slightly higher range, tenor for slightly lower range. In both of these cases, these ranges are inside of these extremes, okay? So now we have a basic system of clefs that we can use that take advantage of the notion of pitch class, but still give us very precise information about register. So remember, middle C is what is shown by any C clef directly. The bass and treble clefs are F and G clefs. They are understood in relation to middle C. So now the last thing that I want to show is how we can make use of these clefs to start to write out basic kinds of melodies. And what I want to do first is write such a simple melody that I'm not even going to need accidentals for it. So I'll write something like this. I'll play that melody for you. Now, because this is a G clef, right away I know what my particular pitch classes are: G, A, B, C, D, E, F, back to G again. What I also know from earlier in this episode is that this is a changing sequence of intervals. Sometimes I have whole tones, sometimes I have semitones. Semitones are always going to be between B and C and E and F if nothing has been altered by accidentals. So I'll indicate the semitones there and there. Now, that means that I have a melody that's whole tone, semitone, whole tone, semitone, whole tone. That is what gives me that melodic structure. Now, I'm not forced to write that melody only using G as my starting and ending point. I could, if I wanted to, write that same melody, but starting somewhere else. How about I start it on F? Now, if I look at what I have here, I seem to just be giving myself notes that are on subsequent lines and spaces. So I'm going to do the same thing. I want that same basic structure. And since I know this is a G clef, that's an F. G, A, B, C, D, E, and F. What I also know is because none of this is altered by accidentals in any way, shape, or form, I have semitones there and there. So just looking at that visually, right away I know that this is not going to sound like the same melody at all, because remember, this system, the lines and spaces correspond to unaltered A, B, C, D, E, F, G, unless I apply an accidental. And that means it's not a consistent metric. Sometimes there are whole tones, sometimes there are semitones. And just by writing a sequence of note heads like this does not reproduce the same interval sequence. You know, if I'm starting out pitch 1, 2, 3 to 4, in my original melody I had a semitone between pitches 3 and 4, whereas I've got a whole tone in this new version. And then likewise, from 4 to 5 I have a whole tone here. There I have a semitone. So this thing is not doing what that thing was doing, it's not going to sound like the same melody. My original melody was this. And the next version I have sounds like this. It really does sound like a completely different tune. What can I do to make this the same as that? Well, I can start to use accidentals. So remember that staff system is not something that restricts my creativity in any way, shape, or form. I can manipulate it, I can alter it to do what I want it to do. And in this case, I will need to apply some accidentals. Now, one thing I might imagine myself wanting to do is say, all right, well, I should have had a semitone between the third and the fourth pitches there and there. So I will do that by creating a semitone. I'll make that an A sharp, okay? And now it seems like I've got the semitone that I want there. So I'll just play the first 4 pitches of my original tune. And I'll play the first 4 pitches there with that nice semitone there. Wow, that didn't sound right at all. And the reason why it didn't sound right is I just jumped into the middle of things without keeping track of what was going on before. I used to have a whole tone between G and A, just like I did in my original melody, A and B, by just jumping in and making that a sharp, so I could get a semitone between A sharp and B. I made that a whole tone plus a semitone, which doesn't sound right to my ears at all. What I needed to do was use the correct accidental in the correct place, and I did not do that in this case. What I want to do is preserve the good work that's already in place, that's accurate and that's correct, and introduce accidentals that are appropriate to the work that's already been done. So if I've got a whole step from G to A, a whole step from F to G, that's good. Whole step from A to B, same thing, whole step from G to A, that's good. This is where I had the semitones. So what I need to do actually is not turn that into an A sharp. I need to make that a B flat. And now, if I make that shift, B flat to C took what was a semitone and has turned it into a whole tone. So I discover that the melodic sequence that I originally had, whole tone, semitone, whole tone, has now been correctly reproduced starting on a different pitch. Whole tone, semitone, whole tone. I'll play them for you. The version starting on G and the version starting on F. It sounds like the same tune. Well, what other kinds of adjustments do I need to make to continue the melody in the correct way? From C to D was whole step, B flat to C, that's a whole step. From D to E, that's a whole step. C to D, that's a whole step. E to F was a semitone. D to E is not a semitone, that's a whole tone. So preserving what I've done before, I need to lower that, turn that into a semitone. And then as a result, what comes afterwards is a whole tone, E flat to F, just like I've got a whole tone between F and G in my original melody. So now these two melodies will sound the same. Here's the original version, and here's the new version. I can produce the identical interval sequence if I correctly use accidentals. And you'll notice that in this case, because of the way I've set things up, I'm using precisely the same type of accidental. I didn't go from sharps to flats. I preserved the first type of accidental that I used. Remember, I started out with an A sharp, and if I use an E flat later on, something would not have been right. What I'm working with are things called diatonic collections. I'll introduce that term in episode 5. But what you'll notice is that in these kinds of collections, there's a consistency of accidental use. So when you do your first assignment for this course, and you'll look at questions 4 and 5, you'll discover that if you're trying to set up an interval sequence in question 5 that's reproducing one from question 4, you'll always be using the same type of accidental. You'll know you've done something wrong if you're mixing up sharps and flats. Now that doesn't mean that in music mixing up sharps and flats is a wrong thing to do. There are lots of occasions where you want to have both sharps and flats. But to start to get to know how this system works, I'm going to be setting up little projects for you where you'll need to be consistent in your accidental use. And that'll just get you a little bit more comfortable working with this type of staff and clef system so that you start to develop a feeling for where these hidden semitones and whole tones are. Over time, you can do things to quickly read these clef systems. For example, a lot of students, just to be able to read them quickly at sight, will learn things, for example, about G clef and F clef, tenor clef, treble clef and bass clef. They'll note that, for example, notes on the spaces produce this lovely word face. And we get something a little bit similar in the bass clef. So there's a bit of a pairing. Face good, obviously is what you get. And that means that if you can recognize that, you see something, here you go, oh, that's a C, or oh, that's an A, right? If you know those little tricks. But it also means that if you see something like this, right away you can say, oh, well that's a B because it's that position right above the A, right below the C, or that's a D because it's between the C and the E positions. So there's a way in which you can leap right into the staff system without having to count away from what the clef is showing you, right? So I don't have to go, what is that? Oh, well, this is G, G, A, B, C, D. It's a bit slower. Oh, that's an F, F, E, D, C, B. If you can start to build these kinds of cues for yourself, you can quickly recognize these note heads. So that's something that's a little bit of a trick that you can develop for yourself so you can begin to read these things at sight much more quickly. But nonetheless, you're going to need to know how to work with the kind of uneven terrain that's built into the staff system, that we have whole tones and semitones kind of mixed up. So that's why accidentals are wonderfully useful, because they can help you correct for those inconsistencies and put in all the pitch information that you need. All right, so this is a basic introduction to pitch notation. The next thing that we need to do is talk about musical timing and duration. As I said, look, this graphic system is one that has a y-axis and an x-axis. We've been focusing on the y idea, which is the range of pitches that we can reproduce. But we need to think about ways in which we can keep track of the timing of these pitches, these note heads that we're producing there. How quickly are these notes supposed to occur one after the other? How are we to hear them in relation to other parts of the music? We need to start to talk about musical time. So in the next episode, we will get right down to that topic, and that will take up the next 2 episodes for us. We're going to talk about rhythm and meter, which is all about how we hear, feel, and represent duration in music.